Editors Canada welcomes you to Letitia Henville's webinar, Getting into In-House Research Grants Editing. And just before we begin, Editors Canada respectfully acknowledges that we are on and work on the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples, Inuit, First Nations, and Métis in what we now call Canada. We honor the ancestry, heritage, and gifts of the Indigenous peoples and give thanks to them. And now I'd like to introduce the presenter of today's webinar, Letitia Henville, and hand it over to her.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Letitia Henville. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm joining you today from my living room, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, unceded and stolen territory of the Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh in the land that's now commonly called the Dunbar region in Vancouver. In making my land acknowledgement in the context of today's presentation, I want to draw our attention to the fact that the granting agencies that I'll be referring to today are arms of the state. So when we end up supporting academics who apply to these grants, we're supporting an application to a colonial government, which reinscribes that power structure. And so it's incumbent upon us to remember that that colonial government has an obligation to pursue reconciliation as called for in the 2015 report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If, like me, you're a settler on this land, I'd encourage you to read or reread the TRC's calls to action and think about how they relate to your professional practice as a part of the system that continues to uphold colonialism. This is something that I aspire to do in all of my work as an academic editor and in other capacities. Land acknowledgements alone are not enough. We've been called to action, and it's incumbent upon those of us who are settlers on this land to pursue those actions as a day-to-day part of our lives. As I've said, my name is Letitia Henville. My editing business is called Writing Short is Hard, and research grant applications are absolutely my favorite type of document to edit. I'm currently a freelancer, but I held an in-house position as a grants facilitator in a small department at the University of British Columbia's Faculty of Medicine from 2016 to 2019. If you know my work at all, then you probably know that I write the monthly academic writing advice column, Ask Dr. Editor, for University Affairs. I've been writing this column since September 2018, and I like to use it as a platform, not just to promote myself, but to promote the profession of academic editing. Many academics hire untrained graduate students as editors. So anything that I can do to help academics to understand that this is a profession that comes with certain key skills, the better that is for all of us who do this work. Last November, I highlighted my Editors BC colleague, Dr. Kath Ennis, as a go-to person for editing IMRAD IMRAD journal articles. And back in 2019, I featured an interview with Dr. Iva Chung on plain language and extraneous cognitive load. So if you are an academic editor and you'd like to leverage my platform to get your name out there or to openly share some information, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. We can discuss potential collaborations. Oh, this is a very blurry screenshot. The other thing that I'm known for is writingwellishard.com, which is a free digital tool that allows you to compare the characteristics, the technical features of one piece of writing to another piece of writing. I like this tool because it allows, it empowers academics to decide for themselves what counts as good writing in their discipline, in their chosen genre, and then model their own writing and edit their own writing based on what they think counts as good writing. I also use it myself to quantify my own edits for clients who may not really understand what editing is and does. So please give it a look. I hope you find it useful. It's writingwellishard.com. I also wanted to tell you that I don't really like sharing my slides. I'm a little nervous about my slides today because I pulled them off of Google Slides and I'm worried that the formatting has gone in some of them, so apologies for that. But this link, bit.ly/getting into resources, gives links you to all of the links and the references and the resources that I cite in the following. So please don't feel like you need to take a ton of notes or screenshots if you don't want to. You can just go to bit.ly/getting into resources and that'll take you there. And Caitlin, I think, is going to put the link in the chat for us. Here is my plan of action for our talk today. I wanted to give you a sense of the recent history and the political trends that have led to the emergence of research grants facilitation as a field, talk about the kinds of work that grants facilitators and editors and grants officers perform, and to share my top suggestions for applying for in-house jobs. I'll then close with recommendations for new in-house research grant editors to set you up for success in the field, in your career. And we'll close with a bit of different next steps you could take if you're interested in doing so. If you have questions as we go through each of these sections, as Carol said, please put those questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That is the easiest way for us to keep track of your questions. So let's start by talking about how we got to where we are with grants facilitation. And grants facilitation is the term that I use to describe the broad field that includes in-house and freelance grant application development, editing, general support. This field didn't exist until just over 20 years ago. Two of the first ever research grants facilitators were Sarah Swenson and Don MacArthur, who started at SFU, I believe in 1999. Sarah is still with the SFU Research Office, and Dawn now runs the Research and Technology Development Office at BC Children's Hospital Research Institute, a good follow on Twitter. So we started with these two people at one institution 23 years ago, and now most universities have entire offices dedicated to research support. Many faculties and some departments also have research support staff, grants facilitators. As a grants facilitator, you can work in universities, in research institutes, in research hospitals, in health authorities, all kinds of organizations where funded research takes place. And what I want to say is that this profession emerged in Canada for a reason. And here is a part of that reason. This is what happened to the CIHR budget over the past 20 years. CIHR stands for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and it's the major national health and medicine research funder here in Canada. And what I want you to notice is this long flat line here between about 2006 and 2016. This represents funding remaining stagnant for about 10 years. And as you see in the orange line, which is real dollars adjusted for inflation, that funding for health and medicine research is actually dropping over the course of that 10-year period. We see a similar thing if we look at funding for the natural sciences and engineering. This data only goes back 15 years, but again, from around 2007 here until 2016, 2017, it's a largely flat line of investment in blue, which represents a drop in real dollar value adjusted for inflation. So what happened during this 10-year period? When I tell the story of how grants facilitation got to be the field it is today, I start 16 years ago with this guy, Stephen Harbour, who was then the head of the Conservative Party of Canada. In 2006 and then 2008, he formed a pair of increasingly large minority governments, and we began to see cuts to funding for research in Canadian government labs and at universities. In 2011, Harper's Conservatives won a majority government, And pretty shortly thereafter, we started to see headlines like this one from CBC National News in July 2012. Death of scientific evidence mourned on Parliament Hill. Scientists, concerned citizens hold mock funeral in Ottawa to protest federal cuts. Harper's government cut funding for what is sometimes called fundamental or bench research. That is research that doesn't have a direct application in industry or in medicine, or it can't be readily and immediately applied. In 2011 and 2012, something like $400 million of research funding was cut. If you wanted funding to study quarks, just because you think it's important that we know more about quarks, that funding was a lot harder to obtain in 2012 than it had been in the years previous. Specifically, it was this much harder to obtain. Technically, I'm kind of lying because quarks would fall under NSERC, the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council, and this is CIHR. CIHR is for health research, but the general trend that I'm pointing at is the same across disciplines. You see success rates for federal research funding applications between the year 2000 and 2015. You see that percentage success rate steadily decline. It's a flat line of investment, a drop in real dollars, and the number of people who want funding is going up. So success rates go from around here in the circle, 26, 27%, something like that in the year 2000, to in the year 2015, between 8 and 18% success rates. So it got about twice as hard to get funding over this 15-year period. Harper's Conservative Party held a majority until October 2015, which is when they were ousted by Justin Trudeau's Liberals. And during the years that the Conservatives held a majority, we saw funding for fundamental research, these open grants, open calls, rather than targeted specific, a call to work on this or a call to work on that. We saw funding for open competitions drop so substantially that the international scientific community began to advocate for change in Ottawa. 2014, more than 800 scientists from 32 countries signed an open letter to Harper calling for an end to cuts in research funding. So things were getting so bad that the international community was noticing. This letter said in part, meeting today's complex environmental and public health challenges requires full participation of scientists from around the globe, but recent reports highlight a rapid decline in freedoms and funding extended to Canadian scientists, which makes it more difficult for them to continue research, communicate scientific information and expertise, and collaborate internationally. Trudeau's Liberals styled themselves as a pro-science government, but no one escapes Letitia's criticism. A year after Trudeau came to power, we still hadn't seen an increase in real dollars to research funding. According to this November 2016 piece from the Canadian Association of University Teachers, funding from the 3 granting councils is still lower than it was a decade ago. Approval of federal research grant applications has dropped to as low as 13%. Laboratories are increasingly dependent on low-paid students, and staffing the National Research Council is 25% lower than it was just a few short years ago. So in June 2016, the federal science minister pulled together an advisory committee to examine the state of scientific research. The 280-page report that was published a year later is usually called the Naylor Report because the committee was headed by former University of Toronto head David Naylor. So you sometimes see Fundamental Science Review and sometimes you see Naylor Report, and those are the same things. And that's a document that I want you to know the name of. If you take away one thing from today's webinar, it's that I think you should mention the existence of the Naylor Report in a job interview. Call it the Naylor Report, call it the Fundamental Science Review, whatever you want to call it. you will look like the kind of person who knows what they're talking about when it comes to research funding. You will appear so credible, it will be great. So this NAILR report pulled together feedback from over 1,000 written responses. It convened roundtables with 230 researchers in 5 cities, and it called for an increase in funding for independently driven science rather than these targeted, propose something related to topic X kind of calls. This is from the executive summary. The panel's overall conclusion is that independent science and scholarly inquiry have been underfunded for much of the last decade as the federal government has concentrated resources on innovation-facing and priority-driven programs. We have no doubt that a major boost to funding for the ecosystem is urgently needed. This report made 35 recommendations, of which one was for $1.3 billion to be invested over 4 years, starting with the 2018 budget. They didn't get everything they asked for. In the first year, they got a little more than half of what they asked for. What I remember from the months after the report was released, around mid-2017, what I remember most is this hashtag support the report. I remember sitting in a big lecture hall at the University of British Columbia and being told that while individuals may have quibbles with different aspects of the NAILR report, it was our job as researchers and research support people to call on the government to support the report, not to quibble with it. I remember being told that arguing about the report's individual 35 recommendations would distract from the overall message, which was that scientific funding needed to go up. So this support the report hashtag was a rallying cry for researchers and universities, and it was a way of advocating to the Trudeau Liberals that they should up the funding for scientific research. So think about our timeline here. The report published 2017, and it calls for 4 years of investment in fundamental research, not applied research, fundamental research, not targeted research priorities, but things where the researchers get to choose what they're going to work on. It called for that funding starting in 2018 for 4 years. Can you see what I'm pointing at here? They were calling for increased funding to fundamental research, not targeted calls, not applied research, not funding for targeted priorities. But what do you think happened to the research funding landscape in 2020? 2 years into the 4 years of this report's timeframe. COVID happened. And of course, COVID shaped what kind of work was funded and still is being funded. And it was not just like research on how coronaviruses, this molecule specifically work. It wasn't just medical research and hard science. There was also research into the impact of social isolation on well-being, research into staying active while staying at home, research into the history of pandemics going back to the Black Death and to the Spanish flu. All of this research now being funded by targeted calls for COVID-specific research, which is great if you're in a field that is impacted by COVID. But what if you're just interested in finding out how quarks work? The NAILR report was published in 2017, and here we are now at time of recording, 2022, 5 years on. When this article was published in University Affairs back in March, the consensus seemed to be that 9 out of the 35 recommendations had been enacted, and 13 were in process and 13 were incomplete. I'm going to quote a little bit from this article. Nathalie Granvaux, a virologist at the University of Montreal, says scientists welcome the increase in funding for open investigator-led research, meaning not targeted calls, but this increase is not translated into reduced pressure on lab budgets. The success rate for open competitions at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, for example, remains largely flat at around 15%, because the number of grant applications submitted has risen in concert with the number of grants available. And the amount provided by each grant has not gone up substantially, so their value has actually decreased in real terms. There's not been enough extra to compensate for the increase in the cost of everything. There is an impression that the government feels like it has ticked that box. Dr. Granvaux agrees that it feels like the government has moved on and no longer considers science to be a political priority. So this is where we are now. Gross domestic spending on research and development, as expressed as a total percentage of GDP, has dropped from a peak of 2.021 in 2001 to what it is, well, 2 years ago, 1.696. That is only 0.003% higher than it was in 2015 when Harper left power, meaning that gross domestic spending on research and development, expressed as a percentage of total GDP under Trudeau, is now lower than it was in 8 of the 9 years that Harper was in power. No one escapes my criticism. A lot of political decisions have been made that have impacted this across the political spectrum. If you thought I was being hard on conservatives and soft on liberals, let me be super clear. Harper was spending more of his total budget on R&D than Trudeau is now, and Harper was the subject of international condemnation for his policies. The reason why UBC is willing to pay over $100,000 a year for a grants facilitator in the natural sciences and engineering is because despite all of the advocacy, the support for the report, all of that work, it's still exceptionally hard to win external funding for research in Canada. We had 10 years of flatlining investment, a drop in real dollars, then a bit of an increase that started to allow scientists to focus on what they think is important for like 2 years. And then COVID hit, and now the federal government thinks their work on research is done. It's not a priority anymore. No one is dressed up like a Grim Reaper and marching on Parliament Hill. Harper left power 7 years ago, so we must be all good. Declining funding for basic research is costing jobs and costing discoveries, but more subtly, it's also leaving some researchers unable to work effectively. As the funding process becomes more competitive, researchers are spending more time applying and reapplying for grants, unable to proceed with research until an application is successful. The increase in funding that came after the Naylor report was much smaller than many folks had asked for, and a lot of it was still geared toward government priorities rather than open competitions even before COVID. Research grants facilitation exists as a field because of the decisions that our elected leaders have made. It's my opinion that if the numbers now were like what they were at the start of the century, we wouldn't have as many research grants facilitators, officers, and editors as we do. I keep talking about science, I keep talking about CIHR and NSERC. What do you think the story is in the social sciences and humanities? Do you think their funding is totally fine? I would suggest not. Here is the percentage success rates for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada from 1995 to 2015. The Insight grants are the rebrand of the old standard research grants. And wouldn't you know, it's the same story. Research grants facilitation exists as a field because universities are scrambling to compete for scarce research dollars. And you must know that the bigger, wealthier institutions can afford to spend more on supporting applications for research funding, which means that researchers at the big unis have higher success rates than researchers at smaller institutions, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots grows. It's not a good story. I tell you this story not because I want you to feel bad, although I do kind of want you to feel bad because I think we have an obligation to lobby our representatives in Ottawa to support fundamental basic research. Would love you to write a letter to your MP. I tell you this story because if you go into this field, you need to know that many of the people you'd be supporting have seen some rough years. COVID has made a lot of parts of the job of the academic researcher difficult, but it was difficult before COVID. It has been difficult for 10 years, for 15 years. You are going to see that difficulty manifest in a range of reactions from the people you support. And in my experience, that manifests mostly as stress. If you want to get into research grants editing, research grants facilitation, you need to be okay with working with people who are stressed out, and they're stressed out for a good reason. And this is the reason, 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 and this is the reason that they are stressed out. Chronic long-term underinvestment in research funding in Canada has led to the rise of research grants facilitation as a field, as institutions scramble to be competitive in an increasingly tight funding environment. We are where we are because of the choices made by successive federal governments, conservative and liberal. And in my opinion, that recent history is why research grants facilitation is a thing. I'm going to pause for questions.
Letitia, we have just 3 questions in the Q&A. 2 of them are comments not requesting a response. There is one question asking, this is a free webinar and we will receive the recording. May we share the recording with other colleagues? If so, should we alert you to such uses so that you know the stretch of your work?
Oh, I'd like that. That'd be nice. Thanks. Thanks for offering. Great idea. Yeah, thank you. I don't mind anyone seeing my opinion about any federal governments of the past 16 years. I wanted to talk next about types of in-house grant editing roles. It's almost 10:30 and I'm in the second part of 4 parts, so we'll go relatively quickly. Here are some of the most common job titles that you'll see. I tend to use grant facilitator, grants facilitator. I use all of these terms fairly interchangeably. These bottom 2 titles are really similar to the top 2. The research facilitator facilitates research by helping to get it funded. The research development officer helps to develop research by helping to get it funded. So you might argue that these bottom two job titles are more like developmental editing. They're more fundamental. You talk to the researcher before they've even written anything. And I mean, yeah, sometimes, but it's really not cut and dry. There's not standardization of what these job titles mean across institutions. So I don't want you to think that the bottom 2 job titles are necessarily more like developmental editing than the top 2. I'm not saying that. In my opinion, you need to talk to somebody to figure out what any of these people do on a day-to-day basis. I know there's at least one currently in-house research development officer, I think is your title, in the room. If anyone wants to add comments on your opinion, if there are any differences between these job titles, please feel free to contribute. In my opinion, one grants facilitator at one part of one institution might do completely different work from a grants facilitator in a different part of the exact same institution. Their job titles do not correlate to specific work. It's just not that kind of job. If you're interested in hearing from actual in-house grants facilitators, I've got a 5-part series of posts on my blog that only the first one's published now, but the other 4 will be coming soon. These are advice from 5 people currently working in-house as grants editors. this is the title. Anyway, these 6 job titles, these bottom 2, I don't see as often, but you can still write and edit grants if you have one of the top 4 job titles. If you are interested in getting into grants editing in-house, I personally wouldn't rule out any of these jobs just because of the title. Any of these jobs could be a job in research grants editing. I also want to mention awards facilitator, or any of these second terms preceded by awards instead of grants or research. In general, a grant is something that you apply for to get your research funded, whereas an award is something that you receive because of the research you've done in the past. The Nobel Prize, the Fields Medal in mathematics, those are awards. So grants are for research that someone is going to do, and awards are for research that someone has already done. Research awards are not something we're going to be talking about today because I don't have expertise in awards, but I imagine that a lot of the role is similar to grants facilitation, with the exception that award nominees are probably less stressed out than grant applicants, because very few people's careers depend on winning an award, whereas getting grant funding can be make or break for someone's career. In my opinion, the rise of awards facilitators in Canadian universities, which we are seeing now, speaks to the value of prestige and institutional rankings, which are linked to neoliberalism and to universities operating like businesses. So what's my point? My point is awards facilitation might also be a role you might want to look into, might have editing in it. The day-to-day work is probably pretty similar to any other of the job titles that we see here, but we're not really going to be talking about awards today. I'm just presenting that as an option if you want to dig into it on your own. My takeaway here is no matter what job title you see on a job posting on a university HR website, you're going to need to talk to people to find out what the day-to-day of the job actually is. You can see these job titles at pretty much any level of the institution. I imagine that if you're working as a grant writer at the top of the hierarchy in the office of the vice president for research, then you're probably writing the strategically important multi-million-dollar grants like CFIs. Whereas if you're a grant writer at the bottom of the hierarchy in an individual research institute or a department, you could be working on just about any grant application. I worked in the department at the bottom of a hierarchy. It was very rewarding, very enjoyable work. If you're a grants facilitator in the VP research office, you could be writing and editing infrastructure grants, or you could be processing paperwork and overseeing other people who do the hands-on work. If you're a grants facilitator at the bottom of the hierarchy, you could be writing and editing grants, or you could be obtaining signatures and filling out forms and shuffling paper and doing administrative work. There are no guidelines about which job titles or which contexts do what type of work. You won't really know how administrative or editing intensive or writing intensive a grants facilitation role is going to be until you get talking with people, whether that's in a job interview or in an informational interview. If you freelance, you are probably going to be doing hands-on editing work 20, 25 hours a week. And if you're in-house, maybe it's the same with the rest of the time doing meetings and administrative work. No grants facilitation job is going to be 40 hours of editing per week. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I would be very surprised. It's just not possible to spend that much time in intensive editing. Can you imagine doing an 8-hour day of editing straight? I can't. So you have to anticipate that some of your time as an in-house grants facilitator will be spent in administration or pushing papers. Some of the time will be developing relationships with researchers and colleagues. It's on you to figure out how much of an individual job is going to be spent doing that kind of work and how much is going to be doing editing. Because some of the administrative paper shuffling isn't that rewarding for me, I'd encourage you to set up informational interviews with folks at the institution where you'd like to work to learn more about who and which roles are mostly admin and who and which roles allow you to get your hands dirty in grants editing, whether that's at the developmental stage or structural stylistic or polishing. I've put a link on my list of resources to a great Harvard Business Review article about informational interviewing. And you can find that link at bit.ly/gettingintoresources. Sorry, that is not legible. Caitlin has already put the link in the chat. Any questions at this point?
There's just one question. Catherine Morton asked about the text analysis tool. I've put the connection to that in the chat. Writing well is hard. Allison Edwards has asked if you are comfortable, can we have your email address? You may be presenting contact information at the end of the webinar. I'm not sure, Letitia, but you can address that.
If you go to bit.ly/gettingintoresources, that takes you to my website and there's a contact page on the website. I'm not going to give out my email address only because this is a recorded webinar that will be publicly and freely available, and I don't want my internet or my email address out into the entire world. But the contact page is on my website, which is also shortishard.ca. Okay, so let's go into talking about some suggestions for applying for work in this field. I'm not going to talk about resumes because I have another free webinar about resumes already. Again, linked to bit.ly/gettingintoresources. So instead, let's focus on the cover letter and the interview. Imagine that you are applying for this exact job at UBC. The job title is NSE, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Development Officer. And the context is, where is the context? It's under department. Support programs to advance research capacity. So you Google that and you learned that that means that the context is here at the top of the hierarchy, supporting researchers from across the institution and probably like just umbrellaed under the VP Research Office. And you know that neither the job title or the context actually tells you anything about how much editing is in this role day to day, month to month. So you've had some conversations with folks at the institution and you've heard that the role does indeed involve quite a bit of editing. So you've decided to apply. What does a good cover letter look like and how should you prep for the interview? Here is my list of things I would like to see you include in your cover letter. Educational background and level of education, total dollar figure you've won in your own research funding, total dollar figure you've helped other people to win, largest single grant you've won or helped others to win, specific training and experience that have prepared you for success in the work, and strengths you'd like to put to use in the job. Let's go through these in order. Number one is your educational background and level. You do not have to have a PhD or a master's degree, although research grants facilitation is a career that's often pursued by people who have these qualifications, myself included. I know grants facilitators who've done postdocs, and I know grants facilitators who have undergraduate degrees, and there are grants facilitators in between with terminal degrees in masters in journalism, masters in creative writing. I think that having the letters PhD after your name can be helpful with some faculty members to get you that initial bit of credibility. I certainly do my job differently because I have a PhD. It's given me lived experience that I draw on. But simply being an excellent communicator with relevant interests and background and reading is enough to get an interview, and it's enough to be great at this work. If you have an academic background, include the total dollar figure of your own funding that you've brought in, as well as the single largest grant you've won. If you don't have an academic background, you can skip that and just mention the total dollar figure you've helped other people to win if relevant. This can be what you did as a job, or it can be as a volunteer. For instance, if you were a senior grad student and you reviewed the grant applications of junior students as a peer, and some of them went on to win research funding, you can mention that. Including the single largest grant you've won or helped other people win it's for context. It helps the reader to understand if you usually work on big infrastructure grants or individual research projects. These can be grants from any country for any competition. I personally would not include grants that aren't research grants, but I imagine that it can be relevant for some particular jobs to mention not-for-profit grants or artist grants. For most jobs, you're specifically talking about research grants and you're focusing on competitive national funding as much as possible. If you've never won a grant and you've never helped anyone else to win a grant, let's talk about that in the next part. You include these 3 pieces of information for 2 reasons. 1, it speaks to your track record. It helps to show that you can hit the ground running because you know how to do this kind of work. And 2, it shows that you're doing in your application what will help researchers in their applications. It's providing evidence to support claims. It's quantifying that evidence, providing it in a way that is easy to understand. The next thing I want you to mention is the specific training and experience that has prepared you for success in this work. People who don't have graduate degrees, this is especially the case for you. What have you done that would make you excellent at this job? What relevant training have you completed? Who provided it? In what context have you done this work previously? How many years have you done this work for? Or if you haven't done this work for years, how many applications from researchers have you supported? Have you ever sat on a review committee for any type of grant? I review grant applications for Vancouver Foundation, which is a not-for-profit funder, and it definitely has helped me to understand the kinds of conversations that peer reviewers have. And finally, I want you to close by talking about the strengths that you'd put to use in the job if you were the successful applicant. Honestly, the reason why I want you to talk about this has as much to do with making sure that the job is good for you as it is in trying to persuade someone to interview you. Because if in this strengths you'd put to use in this job, if you write about wanting to edit grants and they need a writer, that is good information for both of you to have. Or if you write about wanting to hold developmental level conversations with researchers before they even start writing their grant applications, a year, 2 years before they ever apply for funding, but they want someone to obtain signatures and process paperwork, that is important for you to know. Because you can't really tell what a job is going to be like from the job title. You can't tell from the context if it's going to be an editing job. So including information about the strengths you'd put to work can help you to filter out jobs that are not the right fit for you. If the hiring manager likes your resume and cover letter, they will pull you for an interview. And here are the things that I want you to prep in advance of the interview. Challenges you anticipate encountering and how you would address them. Be prepared to answer behavior-based interview questions about working with faculty members. Be prepared to complete some kind of assessment and be prepared to ask them some questions. Let's go through these one by one. Describe challenges you anticipate encountering and how you would address them. These will vary based on the institution and the role. For instance, if it's a role that will work with international collaborators or with people from Indigenous communities, then one challenge will be getting Canadian Common CVs, CCVs, for people who aren't researchers at Canadian universities. The CCV is an incredibly onerous, non-user-friendly platform for entering CV data. And it's required for many different federal funding competitions, and everyone has hated it for years, but it still hasn't been replaced yet. And the CCV presents a real headache and a real obstacle for anyone who wants to work with people who don't already have a CCV. Another challenge you might encounter: if you're applying for a job at an institution that wasn't already research focused, maybe it's a smaller university that recently transitioned from a college to a university, and so it's been teaching intensive. There will be faculty members who are not accustomed to applying for research funding. So you might have a challenge of trying to encourage people to apply for funding, which is stressful and is something they've not done before. And sometimes those applicants will be unsuccessful because success rates in Canadian funding competitions are low. So then what would you do? Another challenge: what if you received more applications than you have the time to edit, and they're all varying degrees of quality? What would you do? These are the kinds of things you need to be prepared to talk about. You can learn more about the kinds of challenges that grants facilitators face by doing informational interviews and by reading some of the profiles of grants facilitators that are on my blog. Next up, behavior-based interview questions. These are the "tell me about a time when" questions. Tell me about a time when you had a conflict with a coworker. Tell me about a time when you had to persuade someone to take an action that they were reluctant to take. Tell me about a time when you had to get information from someone who wasn't very responsive. What was the situation? What did you do? There's a particular formula for answering these questions. It's called the STAR formula, S-T-A-R, sometimes S-T-A-R-R. You can Google it and you just prep a few stories and learn how to answer this type of question. Again, if you've not worked with faculty members before, we will get to that in the next step section. Next, it is reasonable to expect to do some kind of in-basket assessment, some kind of homework or practical test. These are usually a few paragraphs of a grant application, and you read it over and then you do what you think is best with the example that you've been given, whether that's a structural edit or a stylistic edit or a copy edit or some high-level developmental style feedback that's largely in the margins. I've hired grants editors before, and when I've done that, my assessment has been a two-parter. One part was a sample edit, and part two was a response to an email from a researcher. And because I'm mean and tricky, I always made that email from a researcher who was proposing research that was wildly inappropriate. Like, I want to do research on Indigenous people and I want to document their dying language and put the recordings in my archive. I give that as an example of wildly inappropriate research because A, you don't do research on Indigenous people, you do research with Indigenous people. B, their dying language is really not how we talk about Indigenous languages. And C, I put their recording in my archive rather than into use in the community. All of those things should be big red flags. And I wanted to see what my job applicants would do if they encountered a researcher who was waving a giant red flag. In my personal opinion, the best thing to do in that situation when you are a grants facilitator and you see something that looks to you pretty red and pretty flaggy, then you just write an email that says, "Thanks for getting in touch. When are you available to have a chat? I've got some questions before we proceed further with this," because red flags equals we gotta have a conversation. I am not necessarily saying that you will encounter an assessment as tricky as mine. Not every hiring manager is as cruel and mean as I am, but you might, and a polite "let's chat" is totally appropriate as a response if you do encounter that kind of tricky red flag email in an in-basket assessment. You also have the option of annotating your assessment with a rationale for the choice you made, if appropriate. And finally, the final thing that I want you to do to prep for an interview as a grants facilitator is prep your questions for them. I want you to have a few specific detailed questions about the kinds of researchers you'd be supporting and the kinds of funding applications you'd be working on. Are these 200-page SHRC partnership grants that take months to put together? Or would you be working with dozens of researchers on their CIHR project grants? What kind of challenges have these researchers encountered in recent funding cycles? How do their success rates compare to national averages? What is the reputation of the research support unit among researchers? You can really set yourself apart from other job applicants by asking detailed, specific questions that don't have easy answers and that tell you about the culture of the institution and its researchers. I know I'm covering a lot of ground here, but Editors Canada will let you watch the recording again. So if you find a job you want to apply to, you can go back and rewatch that last part. I'm actually going to keep on plowing through the question, even though there may be questions for me, because I've only got this. I've got more slides. We got more slides. Next up, I'm going to share my recommendations for you once you've started your job as a grants facilitator. I'm going to try to do this briefly as I can. Recommendation for newbies, number 1, determine metrics for success in your role. Because as a grants facilitator or editor, you need something other than success rate or dollars won to count as successes. Because the quality of the research that is being proposed is completely outside of your scope of control. You could be the best grants editor in the world, but if researchers are proposing garbage, you are not going to have a high success rate. So to protect yourself, you need something other than success rate to show that you are good at your job. This could be number or size of proposals submitted, number of researchers supported, or it could be the happiness of the researchers who you work with. To protect yourself and to protect your own performance evaluations, there must be something other than the percentage success rate or the dollars won that attests to the quality of your work. Recommendation number 2 is that you develop good relationships, both with the faculty members you support and also with your colleagues, whether those are grants editors at your institution or at other institutions. Have a lot of coffee with a lot of people. Take time away from your desk to chat. To be happy in your job as a grants facilitator, you need to be trusted by the people you support. So let them see you being curious, being interested, asking how you can help. Number 3 is related to number 2. When you are new, you know next to nothing about the work, about the people you support, about their backgrounds. And people will come to you with questions, and don't be afraid to say, I don't know, but let me find out for you. Then go and find out for them. Find a credible source of information and cite your source when you pass along the answer to whatever their question was. The reason I recommend saying I don't know is because giving out incorrect information will sink your reputation as a grants facilitator. You cannot afford to be someone whose reputation is of unreliability, of someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. It is so much more important to be correct than to be quick. Finally, use your professional development funds to join the Canadian Association of Research Administrators, CARA. A lot of what CARA does isn't relevant for grants facilitators because it has to do with administering research after it's funded. But there is a special interest group for each of the tri-agencies, and there's a special interest group for grants facilitators. And Tri-Council tends to go to CARA with new information. They speak at CARA conferences. So that association and its listserv can have real value for you and your work. You may also want to consider joining the new Academic Editors Group that is a joint initiative from Editors Canada and the US-based Editorial Freelancers Association. That group held its first meeting last month, and our next meeting will be a book club scheduled for this time on November 4th. We'll be discussing Helen Sword's stylish academic writing. Final bit, last 4 minutes, next steps if you want to take them. My first recommended step is that you develop a reading list that will help you to better understand peer review generally, grant reviewing specifically, and academic writing in particular. How Professors Think is a qualitative study of grant reviewing in the social sciences, and Academic Instincts has a great chapter on jargon that she calls terms of art. I've written about jargon in my column. You can add pieces from my column to your own reading list. I've written about grant applications a lot, quite a lot. My next step is to read some grant applications. This is ogrants.org. It's an open source database of unsuccessful and successful grant applications, open source meaning free. I love this site. I recommend it highly, even though it only has maybe a dozen Canadian grants on there. My next step recommendation is to consider taking a course, taking some training. As you've seen today, there's a lot to cover, and we've not really even touched on the actual process of doing the editing itself. I learned to edit academic research grants on the job in an in-house position by reading a lot of them and by talking with colleagues, and that took me a long time. So if you want to accelerate that process, you might consider taking a course. I've not taken this one. This is Columbia University's Public Health Office. It's a 2-day NIH American Health grant writing workshop. Again, I've not taken this one. It's on Udemy. It's $105. It's called A Guided Approach to Research Grant Proposal Writing. It seems to be well reviewed. Then there's me. This is my 12-part course called Editing Academic Research Grants in Canada. I've designed this course so that it has separate tips specifically for freelancers and people who want to work in-house. The idea being that it will have paid for itself once you edit your first grant. Please note that this course is not for people who are new to academic editing. It assumes that you have a base level of knowledge about academic editing already. Today's webinar is fairly representative of how I teach. I tend to be dense and information heavy. That's because I know that you can return to rewatch this webinar if anything doesn't sink in. The same is true with the course. It's 12 parts, it's dense, it's information heavy. It contains information that I don't think you can find elsewhere, not in any books and not in my columns. And finally, once you've done that, you can start getting some work. I see 3 potential avenues, all of which can feed into one another. One is to get freelance work. I wrote a blog post about where freelance editors got their first client. Another option is to volunteer. The platform that I recommend for volunteering is called AuthorAid. Its purpose is to connect scholars in the Global South with experts in the Global North who can support them to get their work funded and published. If you've not worked with faculty members before, if you've never supported someone on a research grant before, then AuthorAid is my recommendation for you, with a massive caveat. And that massive caveat is that researchers in the Global South are not your testing ground, your experimental, your place to learn. You need to have taken some of the 3 steps before you position yourself as someone who can help them. Their careers are not your laboratory. It wouldn't be ethical to volunteer as a grants editor if you haven't already done some of the steps I already mentioned. And finally, if you'd like to go the in-house route, then I recommend looking for work in a university, a research hospital, or a health network. You can read profiles of grants editors who work in those fields on my blog to learn more about how those folks found their way. I am wrapping up, I promise. This is how you can stay in touch with me if you want to. In addition to the work I do with Short is Hard, I also run antihustle.ca, which is a resource hub for people who want to align their business practices with their personal and political values. If you are watching this webinar live, then you should know that coming up next week, I have another webinar, Introduction to Academic Research Grants, which covers details about written and unwritten rules that grant applicants should follow. It describes how research grant peer review committees work, and I'm preparing a collection of resources for people who take part in that webinar, and that collection of resources won't be available anywhere else. It's I'm crafting that webinar to supplement the course Editing Academic Research Grants in Canada. So there's not going to be any overlaps in material, but I obviously can't go into the same level of detail in a 60-minute webinar that I can in a 12-part course. As I mentioned, next month, I'll be hosting the joint Editors Canada EFA Academic Edit Book Club. RSVP for that is over at bit.ly/gettingintoresources. And finally, in February next year, I'll be hosting a one-day anti-hustle business retreat. That one is targeted at freelancers and registration is not open yet, but you can join my newsletter, The Shortlist, to hear when the RSVP for that opens up. The purpose of that retreat is to help you to align your day-to-day practices as a business person with your values and your ambitions. What a lot of information, 1 minute longer than I was meant to go. Any questions for me at this point? I'm so sorry for taking longer than I meant to. Thank you for staying as long as you did. Questions for me?
Thank you very much, Letitia. I'm seeing just a couple of questions, mostly thanks in the Q&A right now, but one question that came forward, any suggestions for freelance grant writers who get asked to work for a percentage of the award if the grant application is successful? Does anybody ever do that?
I've never heard of anyone doing that. And I wonder if the fund, if that would be an eligible expense. Like if you get funded by Tri-Council, by the federal government, you have to say what you're spending the money on. And spending the money on work that's already been done, I don't think would be eligible. I wouldn't do it myself.
Okay, no other questions that I'm seeing in the chat or the Q&A, just profound thanks from several people. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. We'll take just a moment to see if there are any last questions for Letitia before we sign off.
Let me know if there's anything that I can do to be a help to you in your career. I live by myself in this empty apartment, and so I love to chat to people. I love to hear how you're doing. Please don't hesitate to reach out.
There was one last question asking, is the presentation going to be made available? Yes, per the details given at the beginning, it will be posted at the link that is given in the chat.
Yeah, I'm gonna post a link to it at bit.ly/gettingintoresources, and Caitlin will email the link to you as well.
Okay, and seeing no further questions, on behalf of Editors Canada, I'd like to thank Letitia for a great presentation today. Judging by the responses, everyone else has found it just rich and rewarding as well to attend. And please do remember that when you receive the evaluation form, it helps us greatly if we get responses to those. And you should be getting all of that material by email within the next day or two. All right. And with that, I'd like to thank Letitia for her time today and all of you for spending time with us. And wish you a good weekend.
Thanks so much. Bye all.
Bye.